Dear listeners, this is the third part of this story. If you haven't seen the previous parts, we recommend you watch them first. Our first concert was a great success. I couldn't gather the original lineup of the band. Some went abroad in search of better fortunes, some fell into alcoholism, and some simply declined, not believing in success. From the old lineup, only Vadim, the bass guitarist, remained with me. But I didn't despair. I wandered through clubs and restaurants, and soon the band was resurrected. Petrovsky's assistant brought a synthesizer to my home, and I began to compose music. Sometimes I used my old songs. Before long, we had enough material for about an hour and a bit, so we started rehearsals. Time flew by rapidly, and the day of our debut was rapidly approaching. The group was named Ricochet. I was immersed in work. Sometimes I stayed up all night to record a musical phrase I had dreamt of. Occasionally, in the evenings, my neighbor Dima would drop by. We had become friends with this cheerful guy. He would disappear on expeditions from time to time and then suddenly reappear, coming over with another batch of captivating stories and an exotic bottle. Finally, we had our first concert. Petrovsky had conducted an extensive PR campaign, and the hall was overflowing with an excessive audience. Everything went brilliantly. The next day, we woke up famous. A week later, Petrovsky signed a contract with us and started promoting our band in a more professional manner. More than 3 months passed. Natasha lived with me. Honestly, I never regretted leaving her with me that cold March night. I almost believed that I had found my happiness. So much so that I was planning to propose to her soon. I was heading home in a good mood, intending to share the good news with my girlfriend. Petrovsky had offered us a contract to record our first album. He was financing the project entirely. Raindrops began to fall. The sky in the east darkened, hinting at not just rain, but a real storm. The outlines of trees, cars, and houses became sharper and brighter. Everything around froze in anticipation of the first thunderclap. Opening the door, I immediately sensed that Natasha was home. I took off my sneakers and entered the room. Just as I thought, there was a faint smell of cigarette smoke in the air. On the couch, Natasha sat, her long fingers holding a cigarette. "Hey," she nodded, her expression detached. There was a strange, vacant look in her eyes. "How long have you been home?" I asked. "You see, just got in." Natasha shrugged, as if it were January outside, not the end of May. I fetched a robe and draped it over her legs. "Thanks. I've been out, my legs are tired." She sighed heavily and looked behind me. Suddenly, I understood that she was avoiding eye contact. "What's happened to you?" "Nothing. I came to give you the key." "Here it is, on the stool?" I didn't understand anything. Natasha looked at me. "What happened?" I took her by the shoulders, but she persistently avoided eye contact. "I'm leaving you. Forgive me. Don't think badly of me. You're not to blame for this, but I can't go on like this." Natasha put out her cigarette and stood up. "I was happy with you, but now I have to go," she said almost inaudibly. "I have another man. I have no right to be here anymore. I don't want to deceive you. It's all my fault, entirely." "Another man? What about us?" "Everything was good between us." I began, my heart aching with pain. "Nonsense. Oh God, what am I saying?" "Not nonsense," she said. "I came here to put an end to everything. I won't come back. I'll just look at you and... Don't worry, you'll soon forget me. You're good and kind. You'll find someone else. Not someone as messed up as I am. Just don't judge me too harshly." There was something strange and unsaid in her words. This must be how a wife behaves after betraying her husband, or knowing that she will inevitably betray him because fate is inexorably leading her there. I shocked, fell silent. My speech deserted me, and my legs turned weak. Finally, I managed to force out through gritted teeth, "You can go. You're a free bird. Farewell. Maybe we'll meet someday. By chance. Who knows how things will be then." Natasha walked to the door. "Natasha?" I started. "Be quiet. I've already made up my mind. May God help you." And there was such bitterness in her words that my heart constricted. "I'm going. I'm terribly tired." She opened the door. We stepped into the hallway. Our neighbor, Dima, passing by us, gave a knowing smile and politely greeted us. And Natasha, just as she was about to pass, suddenly kissed me on the lips. "Remember me, and forgive. She pulled away from me and dashed out the door into the May downpour, which mercilessly soaked the entire vast city, its wet, glistening rooftops and the wind-swayed trees. When the door slammed shut below, my heart stopped. The past cannot be brought back, and Natasha was now part of that past. I opened the window. The room was filled with a warm, rain-scented spring breeze. Men don't cry. For a long time, without averting my gaze, I stared at the meadow covered in bright green grass, with last year's burdock stems poking out. At the old city cemetery with its tilted rusty gates. My hands were clenched into fists. It was as if I was holding my heart in them. Somewhere inside, a pain was born. It spread slowly through my body, filling every cell. How could I quell it? I began pacing the room, from the window to the door and back again. Everything that had happened was inevitable. Sooner or later, it had to happen. Who was I to her? An episode. Sure, what did I really know about her? Where did she come from? Who was she with before? So what if she professed love to me? What can one not invent for themselves? Why did I assume that Natasha owed me something? Who am I to her? A passing companion. And now my turn had ended. Had I forgotten that women are fickle? That they heartlessly, thoughtlessly, cruelly abandon old love for the allure of the new? I had been through all of this before, but life hadn't taught me anything. Never mind, we'll get through this. Everything will be all right. I turned my face to the wind. Men don't cry. After all, these are just raindrops on my cheeks. I fetched a bottle of vodka from the fridge and drank it all straight from the neck. Then, inebriated, I played the saxophone, playing the blues into the night. The gloomy morning brought no solace. I lay on the bed in my clothes. An empty vodka bottle stood on a stool nearby. A bad omen, no money would come. Mechanically, I placed the bottle on the floor. A month later, I locked up the apartment and moved to a small wooden house on Lake Ark in the forest. The house was located on an island separated from the shore by a narrow strait. The island and the shore were connected by a wooden bridge with an electric gate at the very beginning of the bridge. I continued touring, participating in the recording of our first album. But it felt like I was just going through the motions. Something within me had snapped. I tried not to think about Natasha, but you can't command your heart. I would visit home sporadically when I had performances in the city, and I didn't feel like going to the house on the island. Sometimes my neighbor Dima would drop by, along with the local police officer, a young, curious guy. He immediately recognized me as a well-known musician and did everything he could to ensure I had a peaceful life. To keep myself occupied, I took up restoring vintage musical instruments, guitars, mandolins. Finally, I decided to resurrect the beaten-up saxophone. Women clung to me. I had enough money, so I became a tempting target for those hunting for material gains. But I no longer wanted any relationships. I had enough of my first marriage and love for Natasha. I had received a good vaccination against family life. I put down the instrument and looked up at the screen of the surveillance monitor. I could see someone driving across the bridge to my island. I lowered my gaze and finished soldering the broken valve of the vintage saxophone I had been working on for the past 3 days. The unknown vehicle hadn't yet reached the midpoint of the bridge, and I didn't rush to greet the uninvited guest. I just zoomed in on the image to get a closer look at who this troublesome guest might be, a light gray Maybach. How did they manage to get through the closed bridge gates? Well, I'll review the recording later. I peeled off my gloves, wiped the sweat from my face with a towel, and sat down on a bench near the workshop. I leisurely lit a cigarette, took a drag, and watched as the unknown Maybach approached the house, bypassing the fork in the road. From the passenger side of the car emerged an elegant lady in a red pantsuit. She ascended the steps of the front porch and pressed the doorbell. With the cigarette held between my lips, I picked up the sawed-off hunting rifle from the bench, checked the cartridges in the magazine, and headed across the sloping lawn toward the house. I didn't immediately recognize Lena. For a moment, I stood there silently watching her back. Honestly, I hadn't expected to see her here after several years since the divorce. I wondered what she wanted. Maybe something about our son? My heart trembled with unease. "Hey, Lena, looking for someone?" I finally said, She turned so quickly that she ended up sticking the high heel of her shoe into the gap between the porch boards. Tripping, she awkwardly fell on her rear. I found it amusing, but I managed to maintain an impassive expression, not letting on that I found this amusing. Lena got up, holding on to the wooden post that supported the roof above the porch. Hi, Yuri, she stammered. I watched my ex-wife in silence. Well, I'm glad to see you. I turned and headed back to my workshop, clutching my cigarette butt and spitting in the direction of her car. When I entered my workshop, I heard her footsteps following me. I picked up the soldering iron. What the hell do you want? I growled. Lena stared at me, holding her gaze on the broken saxophone in my hands. I could see surprise in her eyes. I knew I looked good for someone who'd been abandoned and robbed. Today I look even better than I did 5 years ago, with a short haircut and a small beard. Until today, I hadn't heard anything about my ex-wife. Frankly, I didn't want to hear anything. There was just too much resentment. Rumors had reached me that her career as a music producer hadn't panned out. The band fell apart. The last to leave was the virtuoso keyboardist. Lena was left without work and without money. She had placed high hopes on her lover, but unfortunately it didn't work out. To sing my songs, you needed to be me. Yuri, stop being so angry. We need to talk. Lena decided to get straight to the point. I don't need to talk to you. And anyway, you should get out of here. I was deliberately rude to her. We can't have any business. Listen to me at least. Lena raised her voice. I have rights to your songs. Your band is on the rise now. I can give you permission to perform the songs, but you'll have to give me half of the earnings from the concerts. 50-50. You must be out of your mind. I was so worked up that I almost choked. Not only did you strip me bare during the divorce, stealing my songs, but now you can't even settle down. I don't need your favors. I have enough material to work with. And you can shove those stolen songs wherever you want, or maybe to your lover. Well, you know where. I stuck a cigarette in my mouth. Now get out. Behind Lena appeared an unfamiliar young man. Hey man, show some respect to the lady. He took an intimidating step toward me. No way. In my own house, someone is threatening me, I said as I grabbed a sawed-off shotgun. Get the hell out of here. I cocked the triggers. Andre, you've ruined everything, Lena squealed. You must have forgotten that you have a son. I'll sue you. She was so angry she couldn't speak. The sound of an engine reached me, and Dima appeared at the door. What's going on here? He asked loudly. They're trying to threaten me, I said as I took a step towards Lena. Dima snorted and skillfully twisted the cheek of the arrogant guy. Lena, looking scared, hurried to the car. We smoked in silence, watching the Maybach with our eyes. We set out on a tour down south. Our first stop was in a bustling city by the Black Sea. We arrived early in the morning and quickly settled into a modern 5-star hotel, right in the heart of the city. However, some unknown force kept luring me to the old town. After breakfast, my colleagues scattered to their rooms, intending to rest after the flight, but I still managed to slip away on my own to wander the narrow streets. In the distant past, this place had been the capital of a mighty empire, and everything around bore the marks of an eastern city. The narrow cobblestone streets of the old town seemed to breathe antiquity. 2- and 3-story houses with projecting balconies and mandatory gardens featuring fountains in the inner courtyards. Numerous craft shops and street stalls adorned with various fruits and spices added to the charm of this southern city. It was mid-July and the trees were in full bloom. Some streets were lined with low shrubs bearing bright purple flowers. An enticing blend of unfamiliar scents hung in the air, carried by the gentle southern breeze, along with the promise of eternal happiness. For a while, I savored wine and cheese at a small street cafe before embarking on a stroll through the old town. I aimlessly wandered through these picturesque spots until I stumbled upon an antique shop nestled in a basement. In the distance, someone played the guitar to the rhythm of a tambourine. Bitter, spicy scents of geranium and blooming hydrangeas swirled in the air. Descending weathered steps, I pushed open the massive door. A bell tinkled as I entered, and before me stood the owner, a gray-bearded elderly man. He was dressed in a long eastern robe, cinched with a colorful cord, and a small black hat adorned his head. barely covering his crown. If I hadn't known I was in Ukraine, I might have thought the shop was located somewhere in Baghdad or Istanbul. It seemed this place hadn't seen repairs in ages. Through peeling plaster, I caught glimpses of ancient stonework that gave the room an aged patina. Several antique chests with worn leather and copper locks stood along the walls. The walls were adorned with coats of arms of forgotten counts and dukes, and an array of antique cold and firearms. All this magnificence was topped off by knightly suits of armor, with a prominent steel breastplate and a helmet styled after a wolf's visage. Indeed, the basement was genuinely ancient, as attested by its true black basalt stone walls. Merchandise was scattered around, including ancient copper pictures, manuscripts in leather bindings with copper clasps, and collections of smoking pipes and hookahs. Waving his hands, the owner began to offer me his goods. However, after a while, his enthusiasm waned. I had no interest in antiques and had stumbled into the shop by chance. I wasn't planning on making any purchases. Eventually, I managed to convey to the owner that he needn't have bothered me, and I was about to leave when he suddenly opened the door to reveal a hidden room filled with even more treasures. I suddenly opened an old chest. Inside, amidst ancient copper and silver coins, lay a men's ring made of white metal. The ring was nothing special, just a signet with a partially worn inscription in an unfamiliar language. Yet this ring somehow captivated me. I examined it closely, holding it in my open palm, and unexpectedly, to myself, slipped it onto the ring finger of my right hand. The ring fit as if it were made for me, like an unknown craftsman had fashioned it specifically. Warmth began to spread slowly across my hand. It was an item from another dimension, somehow transported to our time, where the mastery of the craftsman had been lost amidst a sea of mass-produced goods from China. For some reason, I suddenly wanted to buy this ring. I looked up at the owner and inquired about the price. It seemed the owner's gaze changed. He even looked at me with some respect, and after a brief pause, unexpectedly named an amount that, by my standards, was significantly undervalued. I shrugged and handed him the money. The owner bowed and started speaking rapidly in an unfamiliar language. Dad Yusuf says it's not an ordinary ring. There's a belief that it's the ring of Caliph al-Hakam. Unexpectedly, a voice in Ukrainian sounded behind me. The dagger belonged to him too. I turned around. A young man was smiling amiably at me. The ring is made of iron fallen from the sky. Many have wanted to buy it. The stranger smiled again and bowed. I thanked the old man and my unexpected interpreter and stepped out onto the street. I looked at my hand. The ring sat snugly on my finger. The metal was dull and didn't reflect the sunlight. I tried to take off the ring, but it simply rotated around my finger. I couldn't remove it. Well, I'll try again later. I waved my hand mentally and headed towards the bustling market nearby. After a few steps, I suddenly felt overwhelming fatigue and decided to head back to the hotel. Our performance was going as usual when the police entered the auditorium. A man in a business suit took the stage and demanded that the concert be stopped. Mrs. Ilyana had filed a lawsuit against me. The man jabbed at me with some papers. You're performing songs for which Mrs. Ilyana holds the rights. The stranger practically shouted in my face, spraying saliva. At first, I didn't even understand who Mrs. Ilyana was. Then I realized she was my ex-wife. Almost running out from backstage, our ensemble director intervened. All the songs performed are the intellectual property of Yuri Levin. They were written specifically for this concert tour and have no connection to Mrs. Ilyana. You'll have to prove that in court. The man didn't back down. Officers confiscate the equipment, but our director wasn't someone to mess with either. Hold on a minute. Here are the results of the copyright expertise and the court ruling. All the pieces performed by the group are original. Copyrights are properly registered. What you're doing is lawlessness and abuse. I'm calling the prosecutor's office immediately. The director, a short man, kept raising himself on tiptoes as he spoke. The police captain studied the documents for a long time, and at some point, it seemed like he wanted to taste them. Finally, he handed the documents back to the director. In my opinion, the documents are in order. Sort out your disputes in court. He turned and gestured to his men. Well, what are you waiting for? Go and don't disrupt the performance. Our director pushed the bewildered representative of Mrs. Ileana towards the backstage. I nodded to the cameraman and started a new song in the overload. We played 2 concerts in that city. Then there was a banquet at the city hall, from which I escaped. I suddenly felt the urge to visit the unusual antique shop again. I roughly remembered where the basement was located, so I confidently walked down the narrow alley. According to my calculations, the antique shop should have been just a few steps away. I walked 10, 20, 50 steps, but there was no shop. I turned around and walked back. There was a fruit stall, a boutique with clothes, and next should have been the antique shop. But it was gone. I looked at my hand. The ring was still there, but the shop wasn't. I stood there for a while trying to gather my thoughts. What was this? A prank? Unlikely. But the fact that the shop disappeared was undeniable. I had no choice but to leave the place. The next day I was leaving that city, carrying the spicy scent of its narrow streets in my memory. The disappearance of the shop remained an unsolvable mystery for me. And the ring of the caliph that I had bought, I had been wearing it without taking it off since then. After the tour, I returned to my hometown. Everything was fine, except for some health problems that had cropped up. My heart had started to ache. Things weren't so simple. I arranged for a 2-month vacation with Petrovsky and went to my little house. A device for communication buzzed one morning. Someone intended to visit me. I wasn't expecting anyone, so it was surprising when I heard my mother's voice on the intercom. I hadn't seen her in a year, and to be honest, I didn't miss her. I vividly remembered her scream from our last meeting when she kicked me out of the house for punching her lover. I wondered what she wanted from me now. Maybe she also smelled money? Like my ex-wife? On the monitor screen, I saw a black car driving across the bridge. I went out to the porch and lit a cigarette. Finally, a Honda appeared from around the corner. The same mama's tough guy was behind the wheel. Nothing ever changes. My mother slid out of the passenger seat and, feigning joy, headed towards me. "Hello, son. You look tired." I thought, sure, she's gonna ask for money. She hugged me and planted her painted lips on my cheek. "You disappeared somewhere. Don't call. I worry, you know." She turned on her charm. "Mom, what do you want from me?" I interrupted her tearful monologue. My mother fell silent, clearly caught off guard. It seemed she had prepared herself for one course of action and had no backup plan. "Yuri, I'm having difficulties with work now. I'm desperately short of money. I have nowhere else to turn except to you. Don't forget that I'm your mother. I went through agony, giving birth to you, raised you. My father raised me. You didn't have time for me. Looks like you had other priorities." I nodded towards her lover sitting in the car. Suddenly my mother burst into tears. Tears streamed down her face, leaving thin streaks on her heavily powdered cheeks. "Give me your credit card number and I'll transfer money to you." I didn't have the strength to watch my weeping mother. "Leave, Mom, you're breaking my heart." Towards the end of summer, in the parking lot in front of the supermarket, I thought I saw Natasha. A young woman who resembled her was laughing merrily as she got into an expensive red car. A young, imposing man was beside her. He gallantly opened the door and seated his happy companion in the front seat. He was also laughing cheerfully. I silently watched the joyful couple, and suddenly, to my surprise, I realized that my heart was beating steadily. Perhaps I was beginning to recover. That evening I sat on the porch playing my saxophone. The pain was gnawing at my heart as usual, and I could no longer see anything around me. There was only music, and before me, the infinite universe stretched out, twinkling with distant stars. Suddenly I felt that my heart had stopped hurting. My soul soared upwards, through the crisp October air, straight towards the full moon, immovably hanging above the sinful earth, and soon it twirled in a dance of multicolored stars. But a silver carriage was already waiting for her to carry her to the threshold of a crystal palace, where God lived amidst cold, bright lights. When I opened my eyes, I saw an unfamiliar face. A face leaned over me. "You really scared us, my dear," the stranger gently patted my hand. It didn't immediately register that I was in a hospital, and the person next to me was a doctor. "How long have I been here?" I asked with a dry mouth. "It's been 3 days," the doctor patted my hand again. "You had a heart attack, a rhythm disturbance, but now everything is fine." The rhythm disorder has been corrected, and you're on the mend. Rest now, and in the evening, the nurse will give you an injection. The doctor stood up from his stool. Don't get up for a couple of days. If everything goes well, in about 3 days, you can go home. Indeed, my heart no longer hurt, and I began to feel better. Soon I was walking on my floor, and then I started venturing down to the park. Adjacent to the main hospital building was a hospice. It had such a depressing effect on me that I was even afraid to look in its direction. Nurses occasionally wheeled out terminally ill patients in wheelchairs for walks in the park. I watched from a distance at the hunched figures of ageless people, hidden behind the backs of the nurses. One early morning, when the light autumn frost had coated the puddles with a thin layer of ice, I was walking alone in the park. A new melody was spinning in my head, and I kept replaying it in my mind. Lost in thought, I didn't notice that I had ended up next to the hospice. A woman was sitting on a bench, wrapped in a warm robe. She lowered her head as if asleep. I had already walked past, but something made me stop. I turned back and stared at her face intently. It hit me like an electric shock. "Natasha," I gently touched her shoulder. "What are you doing here?" It was hard to come up with a dumber question. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You shouldn't see me like this. Go away, your Natasha is no more. I've lingered on this earth long enough." She coughed. "I'm incurably ill and I'll die soon. Go and live your life." I suddenly understood everything. She knew about her illness and didn't want to die in my arms. The other man was her invention to prevent me from searching for her. "You foolish woman," I almost shouted at her. "Could you really think you'd be a burden to me?" I embraced her and we sat in silence for a while. I couldn't believe I had found my Natasha again. "Sir, what are you doing here?" A stern voice sounded right by my ear. "You're not supposed to be here." An hour later, I was speaking with Natasha's attending physician. Her illness was severe and dangerous. However, there were chances. I rallied all my acquaintances. My friends found a clinic in Switzerland. Natasha and I traveled to Bern. She underwent surgery and her condition improved. Her eyes once again sparkled with happiness. I brought her to live with me. I left the ensemble, but royalties from my songs were enough for a comfortable life. My beloved was with me. What else was needed for happiness? P.S. Natasha managed to fight her illness for some time, but you can't change fate. She passed away from a pulmonary embolism a year after the events described. Yuri Levin briefly outlived his beloved. He died from a heart attack 20 days after Natasha's death. They were buried side by side. Dear listeners, please like and subscribe to our channel. It stimulates me to release new videos for you.